Welcome to Foolproof Theology. My name is Chase Davis, and I'm your host. It's great to be with you here today. Today on the show, we've got the pleasure of having Jerry Bowyer. Jerry has written a book, The Makers versus the Takers, and we'll want to talk about that on the air as well. But he brings a unique perspective. I actually used it for one of our sermon series, actually just one sermon particularly exploring economics at the well to talk about a creational worldview. But Jerry, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Chase, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So I wanted to hear a bit more about you. We're both fellows with the Center for Cultural Leadership. I haven't had the pleasure of getting to know you that well. And so I wanted to hear a bit of biographical information just to share with the audience and just to get to know you better. Right now, you're obviously an accomplished writer. You do a lot of stuff on research and helping people have a biblical worldview. But what was your story? Did you grow up in the church? Was this always something of interest to you?
I grew up in the United Methodist Church. Exactly at sort of the transitional point when I was very young, there was kind of a holdover from the holiness movement, almost extreme fundamentalism, to a switch towards essentially Simon and Garfunkel spirituality, in reaction to the earlier stuff. It didn't stick for me. As a teenager, I started to read atheistic philosophers. I was influenced by my grandfather, who really kind of raised me during a crucial time in my life. And he was an atheist. And when he passed away, he gave me his library. And so I read his books, and I was defaulting towards atheism. And I went to the pastor. This was the new hippie pastor, not the old brimstone pastor, and said, I don't believe in God anymore. And he said, well, why not? Your mom believes in God, doesn't she? And I said, yeah, I guess so. Your dad believes in God, doesn't he? He said, I don't know whether he does or not. So why don't you believe in God? Well, it's not genetic. I have to have a reason. And he didn't really give any reasons. So that was kind of a searching time for me. I won't go through all of it, read a lot of the classics, when I was in high school, the classical philosophers and the atheists, and also the Christians, the C.S. Lewis's and Thomas Aquinas's, et cetera, or just the one Thomas Aquinas. Eventually I ran across Cornelius Van Til and the presuppositional philosophers. And they really, Gordon Clark would be another. They, and a little bit later, Herman Dooyeweerd, and they really penetrated, I thought, to the center of the issues and unmade my atheism. And so I've been a Christian ever since.
That's fantastic. Did you start going to a local Presbyterian church because of that, or where did you start going then?
I did. There was I was the manager of a movie theater after I had graduated from high school, and there was a local Presbyterian church, a church plant, Orthodox Presbyterian, planted by Dr. Jack Kinnear. And they rented our movie theater to play a Joni Eareckson Tada movie. He came into my office one day, and I had a Greek New Testament open on my desk. I didn't believe it, but I was studying it.
How interesting.
And he, struck up conversation with me, and he did his doctorate in New Testament and was fluent in the Greek, and he gave me stuff to read. And eventually the Van Tilian stuff really answered the questions that I had. And so then I started attending that church, and I also did door-to-door evangelism with him, which didn't, do a lot of evangelism. We just walked around the neighborhood of the church, knocking on doors, but that was a lot of conversation. So there were just hours and hours and hours of him essentially teaching me theology.
That's amazing. That's so good. I grew up, my grandparents were Methodist, and my listeners may not know this. I was baptized. My parents think it was a christening, but it was baptized Methodist. And then they started attending a Baptist church. But I really got turned on to the presuppositional arguments from Frame and others. My professor at Denver Seminary, Doug Grotai, who we've had on the podcast, he's very familiar with a lot of the presuppositional apologetics. He has his own kind of flavor on it. And when I started reading Christian Reconstructionist, I reached out to him, and I didn't get exposed to this in seminary. And he goes, "Oh yeah, you have to read those guys. They contribute greatly to the conversations we're having today." So after that,
Frame, and I'd add Poitras.
Oh yeah,
important
absolutely.
thinkers. If I had $1 billion to start up a Christian university, I think I would, you know, start with Poythress and Frame, probably to build the core curriculum.
Yeah,
Just brilliant thinkers. And lately I'm seeing online a lot of trashing of the presuppositionalist philosophers by this sort of upsurge of neo-Thomists. And it's really, disturbing to me, because there's so much misrepresentation of their ideas. And a lot of it just seems to be trash talk. They don't
sure.
seem to be actually familiar with what Van Til thought. Now, I can understand that. Van Til's hard to read, but Frame isn't,
Right.
right?
Yeah,
Frame is a, crystal clear writer and thinker. Same with Poythress. They're trained in analytical philosophy. Same thing with the late Greg Bahnsen. They wrote with clarity. So we have no excuse to not understand those ideas. And I'm very disturbed to see the misrepresentation of presuppositionalism. And frankly, what reads to me like a upsurge of pride that is associated with the rise of neo-Protestant scholasticism. I can tell you that when I read the scholastic theologians, philosophers, when I was a teenager, they didn't convert me. They taught me that Christians can be intelligent,
sure.
but they didn't teach me that Christianity was true, because they didn't teach me that anything other than Christianity must be false by nature of its own presuppositions. And I would say that the role that they play in many people's lives, frankly, is one of just feeding intellectual pride. So I don't know if you really wanted to trigger me on this, but that's why when I see so many debates between presuppositionalists and the neo-Thomists, the presuppositionalists are talking about the issues and the neo-Thomists are just talking about how stupid everybody is.
Sure.
And how ignorant Van Til was, and how, people haven't read all the books that they've read. So, I really think that there's something here. And I think you see it in the life of Blaise Pascal, who sort of went from, the default scholasticism to something like presuppositionalism. He went from the God of the philosophers to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And essentially, he's making presuppositionalist arguments. You don't come away. Presuppositionalism doesn't make you feel smarter than other people. Presuppositionalism makes you, first, for me, makes you, as an atheist, makes you despair.
Sure.
My intellect is not enough. Nobody's intellect is enough except an infinite mind. Presuppositionalism is a lot of fear and trembling, not a lot of, look at my system, how
Right.
grand it is, and how many distinctions I can make that you've never heard of.
Sure.
It seems, look, I don't have any problem with the Thomistic project in the sense of there's lots of different ways to organize thinking, but I see the function that it's playing now is largely disputatious, not in the positive sense, and contentious, and redefining orthodoxy to include, philosophical categories.
Sure.
Like the simplicity. It just, I think we need to really go back to presuppositionalism. And this is a longer answer than you wanted. At this moment in history, presuppositionalism has never been more obviously true.
Right.
In your social media feed and on your cable TV.
Right.
Any thought that there's some kind of neutrality and that human reason, there's some kind of disinterested human reason out there that if we just make the right arguments will change people's minds, as opposed to people having presuppositions which frame things so that they can't even see the truth or they can't acknowledge the truth that they see. I don't see anything more empirically verifiable than the world that Cornelius Van Til saw coming, which is the moving towards epistemological self-consciousness, and the downward integration into the void. We're living it now.
Right.
I can understand why someone might have been an evidentialist 100 years ago when there was some shared cultural context, but to believe in neutral reason now, when neutral reason and common sense have shattered, I don't get that.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting debate because I have a lot of friends in the Thomistic camp, and I was just talking with some friends. They were joking. They're like, "Chase, you're post-mill, right?" And I was like, I guess I don't know. I'm more Amill, but all these categories and these labels, they get thrown around so easily in order to camp people. And I appreciate the presuppositional thinkers, benefited greatly. I think it's very compelling, especially in evangelism and in preaching. It's very helpful. The one thing that I have benefited from the more neo-Thomist kind of movement is going back to the tradition of Christianity throughout the ages. And I don't think that presuppositional thinkers disparage that necessarily.
No.
They're just trying to speak to our current moment in time in the 21st century. And for a lot of the neo-Thomists, they just view it as kind of a cutting off from the tradition, when in fact it's trying to be faithful to the tradition. So yeah, like you, it makes me sad, because it's like, look, like, you don't have to agree with the presuppositional approach. I mean, I think there's a variety of approaches we can take when it comes to biblical worldview, but yeah, I think a lot of it does seem to be youthful, kind of. Some of it's playful, some of it's not so much, some of it's disrespect, but I think there can be more friendship than there has been. I don't know. There's been all sorts of attacks on Frame, and I don't think there needs to be. I just don't. I think we can all kind of like live in the same camp, learn from one another, especially in a day and age where we all need to be aligned about Christ's lordship and about his authority, and we can mutually enrich one another rather than trying to, disparage one another. So I completely agree.
Yeah,
with you.
I'm pretty shocked by the amount of trash talk I hear against, say, John Frame or Vern Poythress or Cornelius Van Til or even Abraham Kuyper. It's weird. Because, I mean, yeah, does St. Thomas tell you should talk that way?
Sure.
I don't think so.
Sure.
What did Thomas do at the end? He said it's all straw. And same thing happened to him, kind of, that happened with Pascal. The God of the philosophers, Abraham, Isaac versus Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So I mean, Thomas, for his flaws and his virtues, was a humble man who was gentle in his disputation. I never saw, and I read a lot of Aquinas as a teenager. I just never saw the trash talking and this is so ridiculous, it's beyond belief that anyone could. I mean, yeah, the scholastic tradition doesn't do that.
Sure.
So why is it that people who are tapping into scholasticism are doing that all the time?
Sure.
Because I think it's playing a different role.
Yeah.
I think what Aquinas was doing in the 13th century is a different role than what a lot of kind of newly minted neo-Thomist young men are doing.
Right.
He was trying to answer the challenges, from Jewish anti-Christian apologists and from Muslim anti-Christian apologists, using the newly available uncovered tools of Aristotle. He was trying to use the cutting edge tool of the day. It's one thing to use a 13th century or 12th century tool in the 13th or 12th century. It's another thing, out of some kind of sense of nostalgia, to think that, we should only be using 13th or 12th century tools in the 21st century.
Sure.
When we have a whole bunch of other stuff that's happened since then.
Yeah.
Kantian categories, Hegelian categories, analytical philosophy. I mean, we've got a bigger tool set now than Aristotle.
Yep.
Or Plato. Why not use that tool set as well?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Because the point is, I think it's almost like a reaction to modernity to go back to the Middle Ages. But Aquinas wasn't trying to go back to anything.
Sure.
He was trying to move the church forward.
Yeah, and I think that's what appeals to, probably it's a lot of guys my age. I can see the appeal to reject modernity, kind of return to tradition as kind of the meme format, where it's like, even my PhD, the guy I'm working on, is pre-modern intentionally, because I'm so fed up with the modern Enlightenment categories of epistemology and other things. So I think it doesn't have to be an either or, but I think there's a large appeal to where a guy like me who's grown up, I was born in the 80s, and I look at what modernity has produced, and I can be grateful. I can, on the one hand, receive as from the Lord all the blessings that we can communicate over a computer and that kind of thing. But on the other hand, a lot of us are questioning, who are younger, like, this project seems to have run its course. What did people used to do? What categories did people used to have? And yes. I think that's the great appeal for a lot of. So I think for for, because I side with frame if you have to pick a side, you know, but I think the appeal for a lot of my friends who are more neo-Thomist is that kind of like, let's go back to pre-modern categories to understand something fuller and richer than this kind of enlightenment project that we're in.
And I guess my view would be, let's include pre-modern categories. Let's not rule them out. And let's also include modern categories where they're appropriate.
Sure.
I know what I don't understand is why we can say, well, there's nothing at all to learn from Immanuel Kant. Nothing at all. Any categories that come from Immanuel Kant are terrible and must be eschewed because they're pagan. But Aristotle is great.
Totally fine. Yeah.
You know, no problem with Aristotle. He's a saint. All of the pagan philosophers see something. None of them see everything. But there's a tool set. And I think over time we sanctify them. I think the thing is that about the reaction to modernity is that if we're modernists, modernity is in charge of our thought process. And that's the default. The default is, or let's even say now post-modernity is the default. It's like it's in the air you breathe. It's just everywhere. You know, every television program that I watch, the male authority figure is the bad guy, and, you know, whatever, the underling is the good guy, and the church is terrible, and relativism, and, you know, the gay person is always the hero. I mean, it's just constant. It's a never ending barrage. Right. And you have like a wretch reaction, like, I want to throw that up, right?
Yep.
So modernity is in charge. I think it's like barely in charge, though, in the sense that, like, yeah, I'm postmodern, right? Don't do it to me. You know, that's Girard's insight. You know, whether people believe it or not is beside the point. Just don't scapegoat me. You know, just I'll say whatever it takes to not be stoned to death. But the thing is, for reactionaries, postmodernity is still in charge of their thought process, in that they're simply taking postmodernity and inverting it.
Sure.
Whereas the revelation of God in Scripture is the plumb line. And if once in a while it sounds a little postmodern, you know, I don't think it's postmodern, but if once in a while it rhymes with something or it brings out an insight, you know, about, you know, that kind of is a little similar to the hermeneutics of suspicion. We don't say, oh, no, that sounds like whatever, therefore I can't believe it.
Right.
You go back to the text and you say, what's Jesus saying, or what's the prophet saying, or what's Torah saying, and you explicate it exegetically, rather than simply reacting to anything that reminds you of the stultifying liberal cathedral that just crushes all independent thought. So I don't think we ought to be reactionaries. And this is why I think René Girard is such an important thinker, because what Girard points out is that you become like what you're obsessed with, and you're obsessed with your enemy. And so you imitate your enemy. Now, sometimes that imitation is an imitation, or sometimes that imitation is a symmetrical inversion. But still, your enemy's really still in charge of you if you're just reacting to them. And so for Girard, you don't imitate your enemy, you imitate Christ. And then you kind of let the chips fall where they may, as opposed to everything being a reaction. Now, for a young person who grew up with this stultifying, I get why Gen Y and Gen Z are reacting against this, because they have to say everything right. Otherwise, you know, they're you know, cast out of the polis. Mm-hmm. And so there's just like, I'm going to say the opposite, you know, of whatever they tell me to say. Yep. But you're not going to, that's not truth, saying the opposite of the dominant regime ideology.
Yeah. I want to get to your book on makers and takers, because I think it touches on something that's a huge need today, because a lot of people read the Gospels and they read the account of Jesus and how he talks about money, and they read it through a very postmodern, neoliberal kind of almost social justice approach to economics. And I think that's really helpful. But before we get there, I've got to know, how did you go from managing a movie theater to having such a deep interest in economics and where you are today?
Well, I guess I was interested in economics then, but I needed a job, right? I just graduated from high school. Wasn't really ready to go to college. So, you know, I started as a ticket taker, and I did a pretty good job there. And then they had me as the janitor, and I did a pretty good job there. And then they had me as the night manager, and eventually I was the manager of the movie theater. You know, but then I guess I'm who I am largely not because of the jobs I've had, but because of the reading that I did.
Sure.
So I was just, in high school, I was skipping most of my classes and going to the library and reading through the great books, Adler's great books. And then eventually went to college, and sometimes I studied, and sometimes I basically not go to class and go to the library and read the great books. So, that's going back like 40 years. And I just try to do the same thing, just study, just to really try to find the answer. And that's the difference between, I think, an academic life. And I haven't led an academic life. I've always had a day job that has something to do with business, which means that I've had the luxury of being able to just follow the arguments wherever they lead. And when I eventually actually did a graduate degree in theology, and I sort of dipped into that, and I realized I don't want that.
Okay.
Right. Because I did a thesis, and the thesis, it got a good, it was a magna cum laude, et cetera. But they said, we really think this should be a doctoral dissertation. So we suggest that you not accept the master's. Actually, it was a sacred theology licentiate. So that's like a master's plus, and rework it as a doctoral dissertation. And I said, what do I need to do to rework it? And they said, you need to spend a lot more time interacting with modern scholars and the documentary hypothesis. It was on the Hebrew text of Genesis 1-3. Okay. I had no interest in doing that. And I realized I was going to have to spend a whole lot of time like dealing with their categories, and just kind of breaking through the standard academic, like, well, wait, is this a Christian study or is this a Jewish study? Because it's about the Old Testament and you're studying Hebrew, but you're using New Testament texts to explicate the Old Testament, and that's a different tradition. So all of the academic, like the maze of this is a separate thing from this and this is a separate thing from this, I realized how stultifying it would have been if I had spent my life doing that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So I tend to be drawn to, some of them are academic, some of them aren't, but I tend to be drawn to people who essentially, like a Girard, for instance, or an Eugen Rosenstock, who like taught in multiple departments. They were just thinkers and they just read, and sometimes they're lit professors and sometimes they're anthropology professors, or sometimes they're history professors. Now, I don't know if I had the academic ability to be a person like that. So I had to be outside academia, and then I could just spend 40 some years of my life just trying to get the answers to things.
Sure.
And not having to worry if the answer turned out to be something that didn't fit the academic consensus.
Yep.
And this book about Jesus and economics, I think, is a great example of that. I think that the thing that we're talking about really, it shows up in the research I did for this book.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. What inspired you to write a book, The Makers versus the Takers? What did you see, or how did you kind of envision yourself bringing a unique perspective on these matters?
Nothing inspired me to write it. I was nagged into writing it. What inspired me to research the question was a desire to know what Jesus thought about economics and social justice. So I had no thoughts of a book whatsoever. Most of the studies I do with my wife, Susan, who's sitting next to me. So, we study together. For instance, that Genesis work was also something that we largely studied together as our personal devotions. I just wanted to know the answer to the question. Now, a friend of mine who's in publishing approached me and said, hey, I really want to publish a book from you. What are you studying? And I mentioned the work on Genesis, and I mentioned this work. And I mentioned one other topic, which is my study of the passage in Chronicles about the sons of Issachar who understood the times and knew what Israel ought to do. Those are the three subjects that I researched that I was most excited about. He decided the Jesus economics one was the best one to do a book, but I didn't want to do it. I didn't think anyone would read it because I didn't think it really fit into the existing categories that people had. Because it's not a Jesus isn't a socialist book.
Okay, yeah.
There are so many Jesus isn't a socialist books. But see, again, that's reacting to something. This is not a Jesus isn't a socialist book. This is a what is Jesus book. And then let's see where he comes down. And then afterwards, we can bring modern categories of thought back to him and see how well they fit. And that's why my book is, in some sense, almost as critical of conservatives as it is of socialists, because this is this reaction thing. If you listen to Jesus, like not very carefully, he sounds like a socialist. So the conservative defenses against this have been, Jesus isn't talking about economics. Jesus is talking about your interior life. So the story of the rich young ruler is a story about the rich young ruler's idolatry of money. It's about his heart attitude. It's a spiritual internal story, not a social story whatsoever. It doesn't have anything to do with economics. It just has to do with his bad attitude, right? Or the William Buckley school, which is basically write off most of what Jesus says about economics or what he says about social issues in general, because the eschaton hasn't arrived yet, right? So they basically concede that the Sermon on the Mount is socialistic and pacifist. But how do you get away from that? Because socialism and pacifism, create bad outcomes. Well, Buckley used to say, we'll obey the Sermon on the Mount when the kingdom comes.
Interesting.
Right? So there have been ways to essentially try to shut Jesus up, to say, stick to your day job, Jesus, religious counseling. Or, yeah, Jesus, what you say will eventually be true in the second coming, but it's got no relevance now. So it's spiritualized away, it's internalized away, or it's eschatologically deferred into the indefinite future. And so what I found is when I first started letting Jesus speak about economics in the sense of acknowledging that he was speaking about economics, the first reaction was conservatives who were upset, because every time we've opened the door to a Jesus who actually is talking about social issues, every other time that's happened, we've been dragged to a Marxist Jesus. And therefore, the defense is it's only religion. Don't allow. This is liberation theology. This reminds me of liberation theology. Well, in some sense it is, in that true theology liberates. So you see that same thing. You see the top-down view, the mainline church. Jesus is a brown-skinned man who gave away free health care and, would hate the Republicans kind of thing, right? Or you get no, Jesus is just about personal salvation reaction to that. Again, you see the bifurcation, an error and then an erroneous reaction to the error, rather than just going through the texts very carefully, which is what I tried to do. Read them very carefully, look at the original languages, look at the historical context, look at the biblical archaeology, and see what emerges from Revelation, rather than telling Revelation in advance what you will accept as an answer from it.
Yeah, and that's been a huge shift for me personally in the last few years, has been like, okay, given that the Word of God is authoritative for all of life, how do I submit myself to what is revealed in the Word of God? And how do I even apprehend it or understand it, rather than simply reacting to it? Because, to be frank, the main waters I've swam in have been more of the Jesus was a brown-skinned man trying to give free health care to everyone. That's the main kind of, if you want to use the phrase Overton window, that's the acceptable discourse in most of the evangelical waters I've swam in today, up until 2020.
So that's like youth evangelicalism, right?
Yeah.
That's like Shane, what's his name?
Claiborne.
Yeah, I was on a panel with him. So that's what that's what you've had to marinate in.
Yes.
Yeah. And see, what's so frustrating about that is it's like listening to Jesus, but on 1/4 volume.
Right.
Right. And the answer is not to turn Jesus down to 0 volume. The answer is to turn him up to 10.
Right.
And I tried to do that with Shane on a panel, and he's just, I don't know. All I know is Jesus gave away healthcare. Is that all you know, really? Because you should know more. Right? I mean, if you are the prophet, if you are the youth prophet of left-wing evangelicalism, you should know that the rich young ruler was a ruler. He was an archon, a senator, Sanhedrin member. You should know that because it's relevant to the and that they were in Judea. That's part of this historical account. And you should know that when Jesus listed the commandments to this rich young ruler, listed the 10 commandments: don't commit adultery, don't commit murder, don't covet, don't steal. He added, don't defraud. Why would he add don't defraud? Simple, because the man was defrauding. Don't defraud is not one of the 10 commandments. It's not in the Decalogue. It's elsewhere in the Bible, but it's not in the Decalogue. Why does Jesus say to the rich young senator, don't defraud? Because all the rich young senators were defrauding. It was the business model. which is exactly why Jesus's brother James, or maybe it's Jesus's disciple James, we can debate that. The general tradition is that it's the brother, but Jeff Myers makes a pretty good case in his new commentary on James that it's the disciple. But whoever it is was writing from Jerusalem and said, "Do not rich men defraud you," talking to Christians who are sucking up to the rich, using exactly the same Greek word. I think it's only used twice in the New Testament as the word that Jesus, the brother, used in talking to a rich man. So there's social stuff going on here, but it's not rich in general. So the text tells us that when Jesus is talking, giving this little sermon on how difficult it is for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven, he is looking at a senator. Not just he just talked to a senator, but looking at him. So he's looking at a senator who he just confronted over fraud, which was the business model of the Sanhedrin, and talking in that context about wealth. So if we don't pay attention to those details, so Shane Claiborne, I mean, he should pay attention to those details, but he's not interested because he's preset, his leftism. That's now his shtick. He'd lose all his followers. He'd have to start his career over again.
Right.
And so Jesus does that. Then it's Zacchaeus, the tax collector, again, another man of the state. Fraud is mentioned again, different Greek word, sukophanteo, but the same word that his cousin James used in confronting tax collectors and the soldiers. And then there's the money changers who had a government-granted monopoly at Herod's temple and a false weights and measures ripoff built into the system. This is an extractive economy using state power. And all the confrontations that Jesus has with wealthy people, those three that I mentioned, and also the confrontation in the Sermon on the Plain in Luke's gospel, woe unto you rich, not woe unto thee rich, woe unto you rich. And who was present? The Judeans and Tyre and Sidonian, who were the bankers for the Judeans, the central bankers. So he's using second person plural, not third person. It's a specific group of people he's talking to. So every confrontation with rich people over wealth takes place in Judea toward people who are men of the state. Up in entrepreneurial Galilee with lower taxes and a lot more small business and more decentralized, zero confrontations over wealth.
That was one of the most fascinating things in the book. And I try to highlight in my sermon. I'll put a link to the sermon in the show notes for the listeners. But it's funny you brought up Claiborne, because like that is exactly who I was in college. I was like following his reading, and I was in a Southern Baptist church. I was very conservative, and I thought this was just revolutionary, insights into Jesus and how he dealt with money. I grew up in a very wealthy place in North Dallas. And so to me, it was just kind of this youthful, like, wow, this is revolutionary. I think that was his book was about revolution, but it's great that you're bringing him up, because it speaks so personally to my own story. And I think that's what a lot of people miss when I think about money and economics. And granted, I'm a pastor, so this isn't necessarily something I'm an expert at by any means, but I think a lot of people miss, like, well, Chase is just, he's presupposing conservatism or the free market as, the right thing. And it's like, no. Like, this is part of my own theological journey,
right.
Is trying to discover what Jesus was truly teaching. So that's why I think your book is so helpful. It's been so widely impactful, is because it does reveal the social context that Jesus was speaking to.
And by the way, I changed my mind in the writing of the book and in the research actually before that. I didn't want Jesus to be a debt forgiveness person, because I associated it with the youthful left-wing stuff that I was associated with, which is, like a half a generation before you, which is the Jubilee Conference and that whole crowd, the Toronto movement, a kind of Calvinistic liberation theology. They were and Ron Sider to some degree, they were very focused on the Jubilee laws and the Shemitah laws, which they saw as redistributionary. So I had an unconscious reaction. Every time Jesus was talking about debt forgiveness, I pulled back.
Sure.
Because that reminded me of them.
Right.
See, the thing that I'm criticizing, I'm preaching against me.
Sure.
Right. Because I do that thing that I'm criticizing. And eventually I just had to look and say, no, he really is talking about debt forgiveness. The 70 times 7, and then the parable of the unforgiving servant, that's about debt forgiveness. Oh, well, it's about sin forgiveness. Well, they're not in Second Temple Judaism, they're not different topics, because in Second Temple Judaism, they believed that the reason their sins had not been forgiven and they were still in exile is because the Shemitah laws had not been followed. As Jeremiah suggested, Jeremiah says, because you haven't followed these laws, you haven't given the land the rest, that's why you're in exile. And then that goes on, not just 70 years, but 7 times 70. Daniel shows that that's actually expanded because they still didn't do it, even though they were granted kind of a temporary remission, just like in the parable, right? I'm going to forgive your debts. Oh, you're still not going to forgive the debts of the people who owe you? Okay, back to prison. So the sin and debt things, we think of them theologically, they're like very different categories. But in Second Temple Judaism, they were very similar categories. When will the Messiah come and forgive the debts and forgive our sins and end the exile? Mm. And they didn't imagine a Messiah who would forgive sins but not debts, or a Messiah who would forgive debts and not sins. There was a debate about whether there'd be two Messiahs. One would be a high priest who would forgive debts, and the other would be a military Messiah. The truth is there's one who's prophet, priest, and king. There were some debates, but it was pretty much a given thing that debt forgiveness and sin forgiveness were to happen in concert with one another. I didn't want a debt-forgiving Jesus because it reminded me of Ron Sider and Bob Goudsward and the Jubilee conferences and all the rest of it. But the text took me there.
Yeah.
Right? So there I went.
That's great. Yeah, so I would recommend, I'll put a link to the show notes to the book. The question that really prompted me reaching out was not only because we had a mutual connection with the Center for Cultural Leadership, but it's a question my wife and I have been wrestling with as we spend money, use money wisely, or attempt to. Is it seems like in the last few years, particularly, especially in a liberal context like we are in Boulder, there seems to be a lot of participation in kind of social justice causes by corporations and businesses. I'm very familiar with growing up in the Southern Baptist Church with boycotts on Disney, or I even had a guy in my high school. He set up a table. I went to a private Christian high school. He set up a table and he was like, do you commit as a Christian not to buy from these brands because they participate in these activities? And as a high school student, I was like, I don't know. I'm not sure. But it feels today it feels like a very pressing question. And particularly when I go into business and I see the raised fist flag, right? Kind of the Marxist flag. And I'm going into that business just to buy a cup of coffee. My gut instinct at this point is like, don't. Just I want nothing to do with that. That's just part of the spirit of the age, kind of this demonic Marxist, neo-Marxist movement. And you see that with the trans flag or anything like that. And right. So how would you counsel a couple like us who's trying to figure out, okay, do I only buy from brands that are aligned, or do I, how should I navigate these things, these issues of spending money, given such a heightened climate economically? You could even broaden it with corporations involved in ESG and diversity, equity, and inclusion, who are basically trading their bottom line for a social credit system that beholdens them to certain neo-Marxist movements. So how do you navigate those kind of things?
You mean personally, or how do I recommend others, or?
Yeah, I think recommend others would be what I would be asking. And by others, I mean me. How would you what advice would you have for me?
Yeah, I would say that this is a matter of meat sacrifice to idols.
Okay.
This is, or adiaphora. So I guess the way I would look at this is, sorry, giving a little instruction here.
You're good.
I guess the way I would look at this is, it's not a matter of conscience. It is a matter of, it's not a matter of law. It's a matter of conscience,
okay,
like meat sacrifice to idols.
Okay.
So it is not a sin to go into a Starbucks with the upraised fist. I have similar reactions frequently, and I have had, different things that I have been unwilling to do business with. I mean, I have my own particular issues. Like, we just decided, after the scandal with his daughter, we weren't going to watch any more Woody Allen movies.
Right.
Now he's done some good movies, but I haven't seen the new ones,
Right.
or Roman Polanski. There are some things, if we're watching television and there are certain, there's bad language, but sometimes there's blasphemous language, like particularly heinous blasphemous language. Okay, let's find something else.
Right.
Um, in our personal business, there's situations where we had opportunities, say for doing business with tobacco companies. That was one, for example, or doing business with someone kind of indirect, but who had operated abortion clinics.
Right.
And we said, we're just not going to do this business.
Right.
Right. Direct hit to the bottom line, but it's an offering. Right. I don't think it would have been a sin, by the way. I mean, we wouldn't have been taking her abortion money. We wouldn't have been promoting abortion. This is someone who had operated abortion clinics, who was working for a different institution and was in a position to steer advertising dollars our way. And we essentially said, we don't want anything that comes from you.
Right.
And that was an opportunity to explain why, because of the blood on your hands.
Yeah.
You're going to meet God someday and you're going to have explaining to do. So this is the time to deal with it now, not after. After that. So mostly I've focused not on consumption, but on investment.
Okay.
And in Christian finance, the discussion has really been around sin screens. So if somebody has a gay pride day, then you can't have them in your portfolio. Of course, now everybody has a gay pride day.
Right.
So you'd be essentially down to penny stocks. I mean, the groups that have been into sin screening, for decades, they would essentially not be able to function if they hadn't loosened up their standards. So was it a moral absolute or not? So my view is that we are withdrawing from the conversation when we do that, and that instead we ought to be entering into the conversation, not divesting, but moving forward and investing and then engaging with those companies. Jesus sat down with tax collectors and prostitutes, and he was not made unpure by that.
Right.
The Pharisees thought that he was. The Pharisees said, well, that's ill-gotten gains. That was their doctrine. But that apparently it's not the New Testament doctrine, or even the Old Testament doctrine, I think, that receiving ill-gotten gains makes you a participant in the sin. You can debate that a little bit in the Old Testament, but with the coming of the incarnate second person of the Trinity, and then the shedding of the third person of the Trinity into the world, the power of the gospel is such that it's holiness that's contagious, not unholiness. But that does mean we ought to be doing something about it, not just passively receiving the dividends from our passive investments. So the business that's been growing for us more than any other, we didn't intend for it to be a business eventually. We're just trying to take responsibility for ownership and shares in funds that we were helping to create and maintain, was to start voting and talking to these companies. What's happened is other institutions and financial advisors have said, wait a minute, I want to do that too. Can you help me do that? So basically now that's become my full-time job, and really 2 or 2.5 of us here at Bowyer Research to sit in on an annual meeting, which is logging on to help people vote their proxies, which is the ballot for companies, and to help financial advisors put proposals on the ballot. Like we've worked with David Bahnsen recently to put a number of proposals on the ballot, including JP Morgan Chase, largest bank in America, who canceled the account of Ambassador Sam Brownback, a religious liberty advocate. And they have not given any answer that's been satisfactory to the ambassador or to any of us who've asked the question. So we're taking it right to the shareholders. David is, with our help, taking it right to the shareholders and starting that debate and forcing that debate, the debate that they didn't want to have. So this is really, I think we really need to get out of retreat mode and into invade mode. In Ephesians 6, you have the armor of God that's described, right? You have breastplate of righteousness, right? The sword, the shield, it.
Yep.
Well, what you don't have is a back plate. There's no armor on the back. And I think there's a reason for that, because retreat is not one of the tactics that we're permitted. It's forward, do or die.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's great. I think that kind of pitching it that way really helps people like me, teach others, equip others, because I have a lot of Christians that are disappointed, frustrated, upset, and looking for alternative investment opportunities. And so pitching in the category of conscience rather than law is really helpful. What do you make of, just last question before we close out, would be the idea of creating kind of parallel economies, and really the way I kind of frame it in my mind is, you see how much effectiveness the Mormons, they're very effective out in Utah and other places, as far as doing business together and investing together in their own initiatives to buy property and do these kind of things. It seems to me that Christians could learn something there in terms of creating kind of parallel economies. And I think in the coming days, as Christians may even be shut out of the marketplace, maybe for Christians like that don't have the opportunity to go to JP Morgan Chase and put those ballots forward and push the issue. What do you make of the kind of new movements that are trying to start parallel economies? Do you think that's prudent or unwise?
I think it's prudent as one tactic, but not as the only tactic.
Okay.
So you're not going to have a parallel, power plant. So some things require a lot of scale, and some things don't. So I don't think we have to live something closer to subsistence lives, so that we're always doing business with Christians. So I don't think we ought to be guilted into it. But on the other hand, I'm happy when I see parallel Christian economy popping up. But then I'm all the sadder when I see it popping up and being done shoddily.
Sure.
And eventually kind of going back to well, you should be doing business with us because instead of doing business with sinners.
Sure.
So earn it, right?
Yeah.
So I'm for it, but I wouldn't make it a universal rule. I do think as we become more apostate as a nation, if that's likely to happen, that there may be more need for like cities of refuge of that type.
Right.
But to me, it's not a given that we're going to become more apostate as a nation. A lot of people call America a post-Christian society, and I don't think that's true. I think it's a pre-Christian society. I think it was partially Christian with the founders, a mixture of natural law, some deism. Certainly biblical Christianity was a heavy influence there, but it was syncretistic. So I'd say it was a half Christian society. I mean, a fully Christian society would not have said, let's keep the slave trade going for another 2 decades.
Sure.
Right. So there was something terribly wrong. But on the other hand, they acknowledged for the most part the nature of that sin. All right. So half Christian to apostate to actually Christian. That's the path that I expect. So I want to be influencing the major institutions to the degree that we have major institutions. So where do you want to have influence for the kingdom? Everywhere. And sometimes influence is separate institutions, and sometimes influence is, in the bigger institutions. Wherever God gives opportunity, that's where you express your interest. So I'm very much in favor of some of these parallel things that are popping up. And I try to promote them to the degree that I can. But sometimes there's a little bit of, well, you got to do business with us. No, I don't.
Sure.
You still have to earn my business.
Sure.
You don't earn my business just by being a Christian.
Yeah.
You earn my business by running a good business. But absolutely do good to all, especially to the household of faith. So I would, in my practice, I would definitely, advantage a Christian business that actually is good at it. I won't take inferior services or products as part of a religious guilt manipulation thing.
Yeah,
I see a fair amount of that in finance, and it bothers me. A kind of a religious guilt sell. That's not the way to supplant these institutions. The way to supplant them is to be better. Now we've got structural challenges, right? Because the Fed, with easy money, giant institutions are hugely advantaged. Rather than small institutions, right? They get the money first, the big banks, et cetera. So we've got a work cut out for us. But then again, it's God's work to deal with those big things. We just have to be faithful. So I would say in favor of parallel when it's the right move, but not universally. Everything has to be a parallel Christian economy and a subculture. We didn't convert Rome just by being, a lot of it was just being part of other institutions. Erastus was the oikumene of Corinth. That wasn't a parallel institution, right? So Christians were in Nero's household. And yes, there are also parallel institutions as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, Jerry, this was great. This was very helpful for me personally, so I appreciate your time. If people wanted to hear more or learn more about you, obviously I'll put a link to the book in the show notes. Where can people follow you, keep up with the work you're doing?
Everything I do, I put on social media, whether it's the Salem editorials or the World News Group opinion pieces or white papers or whatever. So just, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, just spell Bowyer, Bowyer, Jerry, Bowyer. You'll be able to find me and follow along.
That's great. All right. Well, thank you so much for being here. Hey, if you're a listener and you enjoyed this episode, I'd love for you to partner with me, support the podcast Foolproof Theology. You can go to the Patreon link in the show notes. I need all the help I can get here just to cover basic cost of keeping a podcast up to date. I spend about 4 hours a week editing, making sure this stuff gets publicized, and I really appreciate all the supporters on there. You can ask me questions, interact with me directly on there, comment on there on any videos, and also suggest topics. So go sign up on the Patreon, and that'll be a great way to further the mission of Foolproof Theology to dive into these topics in more detail and advance the cause of Christ everywhere. So thanks so much for joining us today. We'll see you next time.